Bien, entonces comenzamos. Tenemos hoy día a una invitada muy especial, Katharina Pistor. Ella es una destacadísima académica y escritora sobre gobierno corporativo, dinero y finanzas, sobre derechos de propiedad y derecho comparado a instituciones jurídicas. Es autora de 9 libros, autora o coautora de 9 libros, La ley del capitalismo y cómo transformarlo, donde ofrece un estudio de los fundamentos jurídicos del capitalismo, las razones por las que el sistema debe transformarse y las acciones que podemos emprender. Su libro anterior, El Código del Capital, cómo el derecho crea riqueza y desigualdad, examina cómo activos como la tierra, la deuda privada, las organizaciones empresariales o el conocimiento se transforman en capital a través del derecho contractual y otros mecanismos. Ese libro fue nombrado como uno de los mejores libros del 2019 por el Financial Times y el Business Insider. La profesora Pistor publica extensamente en revistas jurídicas y de ciencias sociales. Es además una destacada comentarista sobre criptomonedas y ha testificado ante el Congreso sobre la falta de supervisión regulatoria de las criptomonedas internacionales propuestas. Antes de incorporarse a la Facultad de Derecho en la Universidad de Columbia en el 2001, la profesora Pistor ocupó puestos de docencia e investigación en la Facultad de Derecho de Harvard, la Escuela Kennedy de Harvard y el Instituto Max Planck de Derecho Internacional en Hamburg, Alemania. Ha sido profesora visitante en la Facultad de Derecho Carey de la Universidad de Pensilvania, la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Nueva York, la Universidad de Frankfurt, la London School of Economics y la Universidad de Oxford, y recientemente, muy recientemente, de hecho hace 2 semanas, tuvo a su cargo las afamadas y prestigiosas Adorno Lectures en el Instituto de Investigación Social de la Universidad de Frankfurt. Es investigadora asociada del Centro de Investigación de Política Económica y fue investigadora principal de la Iniciativa Global de Finanzas y Derecho. En el 2012 recibió junto a Martin Helvig el Premio de Investigación Max Planck sobre Regulación Financiera Internacional y en el 2014 el Premio Allen y Overy al Mejor Documento de Trabajo sobre Derecho del Instituto Europeo de Gobernanza Corporativa. También ha recibido becas de investigación del Instituto para el Nuevo Pensamiento Económico y la Fundación Nacional de Ciencias. Dicho todo esto, le doy la palabra a la profesora Katharina Pistor.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come to Lima, Peru. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I really enjoyed participating in this day today because I'm learning a lot when I participate in events and talk to people in other disciplines. And one of the benefits of having written a book like The Code of Capital, which was aimed at talking to multiple audiences, is actually then to go to this audience and continue the conversation. So what I'm going to talk about today is largely based on my new book. I just gave Gianfranco a copy. It just came out on the 30th of September in the US. It's coming out in Europe shortly, and I hope it will make its way as well down to Latin America at some point. It's called The Law of Capitalism and How to Transform It. And I should say it's part of a series of books that are edited by Jed Purdy, who is at Duke Law School, and David Grewal at Berkeley. They were trying to sponsor a series of books that would create a foundation for the new thinking in the law, which is largely associated with the law and political economy movement. So there will be books on money by Lev Menand, there will be a book on antitrust by Lina Khan, etc., and David and Jed will be writing a book on democracy. So they asked me to write on something like the law of capitalism, and I then decided that I had to also push the envelope and ask questions about its transformation. Yale University Press first wanted me to write The Law of Capitalism and How to Fix It. And I said, no, we're not fixing it, we're trying to change it. So here we go. So my definition of capitalism that I give in this book, and it's kind of a different perspective than the Code of Capital. In the Code of Capital, I really tried to understand the micro-institutional framework of how to create capital. And of course, this kind of fits into a broader system, but I was more focused on the institutional structures and the political economy of the institutional structures. I'm now basically stepping back and looking at the bigger system. So I'm saying, and I'm not the first to say this, David Grewal actually was the first, I think, to say capitalism is a juridical system. So I'm saying capitalism is a legal regime. And why is capitalism so reliant and actually dependent on the law. I'm basically saying that the essence of capitalism is the attempt to monetize future returns today and to realize these gains today. So capitalism is always about the future. It's always trying to project something in the future, but then also to cash in possible future returns today. And that's a tall order when you think about this. What do you need as a society to make sure that people can have some ideas about future return and actually make money with them today? And there are two things that you need for this: the legal system and the money system. The legal system, because you fortify these claims into the future. They're enforceable today, you can sell them to others. And the money system, of course, is because you convert these claims on future returns into cash or cash-like instruments that you can use to acquire other things. So it takes not only a village, it takes an entire system. It takes two social resources to create private gains through capitalism. So more generally, you could say capitalism is a system that employs two social resources, two collective social resources that exist only because societies create them and live by them: the legal system and the money system, and they use this for private gain. So when I was writing this book, I was sort of trying to think about what actually makes our law capitalist. And of course, interestingly enough, in the world today, in the northern Western world, we never ask the question whether the law is capitalist and what makes it capitalist. We're just pretending that it's just the legal system, it's the law. You get, of course, a little bit of a sense of it when you look at the words that are used to describe the civil codes in the European context. So the civil code in France or in Italy or in Spain or in Germany, even we call it like the bourgeois civil code, das bürgerliche Gesetzbuch. But in terms of theories, there were actually debates in the early 20th century that asked the question, what is capitalist law? What makes capitalist law capitalist? And these debates were, of course, all about the socialist future. So Karl Renner was one of the advocates here, and another one was Pashukanis. There were many more, but I'm just picking two of the most well-known, perhaps, in that context. Karl Renner wrote a book in 1908 about the private law institutions of capitalism. And his theory was that, in effect, capitalism is defined in a Marxist sense by the materialist conditions. And that also means that the law is superstructural, and that if you change the materialist conditions, the law will change. So the causality, if there's any causality, it goes from materialist condition to the law. That also means that if you have a legal system, you can fill it with different conditions, and thereby the law becomes different. Pashukanis made a lot of fun of Renner. He wrote basically a book kind of in response to him a little later. It was published in the early 1920s in Russian and then translated into German in about 1927. And he said, no, that's too easy. Capitalist law is defined not only by the materialist conditions, but the legal system has a particular form, which is the commodity form. The law itself has the commodity form. And on top of that, he said that capitalist law is characterized by an antithesis of public and private law. He kind of anticipated an argument that many legal realists have made ever since, which says that all law is necessarily public because in the end it depends on public enforceability. That is the possibility to execute something in a court of law, and the court of law is authorized by a state, so it's in the end public. And Pashukanis basically said you could just as well say that all law is private because that's where it comes from. When you trace it back to Roman law, the original legal framework were actually contracts and relations among the Roman citizens. They would go to a magistrate, and the magistrate would have to give them an action so that they could enforce a certain type of claim, but it was a very much private-driven legal system. And I think this is also something important to remember, because we sometimes assume that we first had an ideal world in which we had a constitutional democratic system, and then somehow capitalism eroded this. But as Jonathan Levy, for example, has said recently in his book about stages of American capitalism, capitalism was there first, and then came democracy. I think capitalism is deeply intertwined with the development of the modern nation state. But the modern nation state was not democratic at the get-go, right? It became democratic at a certain point, and it developed certain constitutions with certain characteristics that were very beneficial to capitalism. So what are the premises of capitalist law if you look at it from a critical perspective? First of all, as I just said, capitalism precedes democracy. And on top of that, I would say that our constitutional democracies actually fortified many of the principles that helped capitalism and that insulated it from public intervention. Our constitutional democracies, of course, are based on ideas of individual rights. This is one of the checks on too much public power. So you have individual rights, including property rights or the sanctity of contracts. But this also means that the collective, represented by the state, has only limited power to go against property rights or the sanctity of contracts, right? So there's always this tension. And I think here, again, something that Pashukanis saw very clearly, the antithesis to the duality of public and private law. And I will say more about this in a second. The second important premise of capitalist law, again, also based on Pashukanis' ideas, is the duality of legal orders. We have not one legal order, we have two. And importantly, I think that's really critical, they're based on different normative foundations. So on the one hand, we have the constitutional law, which has the idea of collective self-governance enshrined in it, but at the same time also constrained by individual rights that are limiting the extent to which majority can govern. There's still the protection of individual rights, and there are very good reasons for that, but you have to sort of see this is what it is. It's supposed to be collective with certain constraints given by individual rights and of course other checks and balances that we build into these systems. The private legal order is built on very different principles. It's built on the idea of private autonomy. As private citizens, we can do to one another whatever we can do, to the limits of fraud and abuse, but contractual consent can get me a long way in imposing my will on many other people. So for a long time, we have thought that property rights is the most sort of oppressive instrument that we can use. I think we have to take a closer look at contracts. That is very, very visible now in the digital big tech era, but I think it has been visible for quite some time. I'll come back to that topic as well. But within this duality of legal orders, we basically have two normative principles wrestling with one another. The one is collective self-governance, and the other one is private autonomy, driven to the point where as long as I can do it, I can impose on others my will because I can get them to consent. Right? So in the idealistic form, of course, we're thinking about two individuals that come together in free contracts, and then once they have found consensus, fine, they can agree to this. In the reality, of course, we have very different bargaining power, and so one party typically has the upper hand here. And then on top of that, I would also say in this dual legal order that we had constructed with these different normative premises, we also have a very strong preference for private self-ordering. And there's lots to be said for it, also for the decentralized adaptation of the law to changing circumstances, but it also means, again, that we have tilted the legal system and the way in which it governs us collectively and individually to enforce private ordering over collective self-ordering by and large. So these are just the premises. Then in this new book, I'm identifying basically several features that allow capitalism to reconstitute itself. So when I started this book, I posed myself the puzzle, which goes as follows. How is it that a system, which I have argued in the Code of Capital, is actually coded in law? Capital is sort of coded in law. You need property rights and contracts and corporate and trust law. And with these institutions, you can code almost any asset. Give me any object, any promise to future payment, any idea. And with the right legal coding, I can create wealth. And as a result, inequality, right? So how is a system that is so deeply entrenched in law, how is it so difficult to govern this system by law, to contain and restrain the system through law? And in part, of course, you can already get at some of the answers by thinking about Pashukanis' idea of this duality or antithesis of public and private law. But if you want to get more specific, I've identified in this book 3 features that allow capitalism to reconstitute itself through law time and again. One is private empowerment through law. The second is the decentralized access to institutional coercion. And the third is legal arbitrage. So when I came to this puzzle and I thought about sort of the historical context in which I was posing it, I was basically saying we have tried time and again to contain the excesses of capitalism by invoking public regulation. So what do? After World War II in the US already in the 1930s, we do the New Deal, we do financial regulation, and we contain capital flows, we impose capital constraints after World War II. We're trying to enhance some labor rights. We're doing all kinds of things to somehow tame the beast, mostly with public-type regulation. But almost the minute that we put these rules and regulations in place, somehow capital seems to be trying to get through the gaps and come out again and then reconstitute itself. And I'm trying to understand now how this happens. And here are the three features as to how this happens: private empowerment, decentralized access to institutional coercion, and legal arbitrage. Let me just go back to this. What do I mean by private empowerment? That's basically the empowerment that we give individual actors through private law. Private law has been around for centuries. It was codified in Europe at a certain point in the common law. It's never been fully codified. It's law that evolves through practice, once in a while vindicated or validated by a court of law, and very often picked up by legislation and then generalized. But it's a legal system that operates mostly through decentralized mechanisms, contracting, the assertion of property rights. Property rights are supposed to be defined by the states, but nonetheless you can redefine rights in a way that they get property rights protection. Business organizational law, all these things evolve basically transaction by transaction. And if they're challenged, then a court will have something to say. But as long as they're not challenged, they have basically the presumption of legality. Because as a private actor, you can just go out and say, this is legal. And if you don't like it, challenge me, you have to bear the burden of taking me to court. So legal empowerment is basically, I give you the property rights, I give you private autonomy, and within that you now reorganize your own private space. The second feature of capitalist law is that we give individual actors, private actors, and here I am not talking only about you and me as natural persons, but about legal persons as well. They have access to the centralized means of coercion by way of litigation, right? So the state is very often defined as the centralization of an institutionalized centralization of the means of coercion, but we give individuals and individual actors access to the means of coercion because they can litigate. Now, who has the right to litigate what, where, against whom, on what conditions, and who bears the costs, are all questions that actually already shape the way in which some people have better access to the means of coercion than others. And of course, that again shapes also our relations in the law. And the final feature of capitalist law is legal arbitrage. And legal arbitrage basically means several things altogether. Is that you can get around the purpose and maybe meaning of the law by still working with the letter of the law. You're compliant with the formal letter of the law, but you're not necessarily complying with the spirit of the law, and you're thereby evading actually what it's supposed to be. Very good example is the shadow banking system, which is banking outside banking institutions that are regulated. You're trying to do the same thing just without the regulatory costs, and therefore are gaining a comparative advantage vis-a-vis everybody. Legal arbitrage is to some extent inherent in all law because law is relatively incomplete and ambiguous. Most legal rules are fashioned in a way that they can be interpreted and shall be reinterpreted because you enact them for many years to come, very often without any sunset provision. And so they must be adapted to changes in the future, but that also means that if you have a way to adapt them, then you can also shape the law by which others might be bound in the future. So that's one reason. Law is incomplete. The second is we have multiple legal orders. Most systems have multiple legal orders that are stacked on top of each other and are not fully coherent. There are frictions. And within those frictions, you always have opportunities for legal arbitrage. Think about, of course, private and public law, municipal law and state law, different national legal systems that can be picked and chosen by different parties. So choice of law is an important source of legal arbitrage. If I don't like corporate law in Illinois, I take the Delaware law and still can do my business in Illinois. I can even do business in Israel or in Germany or in Peru for that matter nowadays if I'm a Delaware corporation. So the ability to find a form that allows you to do what you want to do legally, formally legally, even if it's at odds with local norms, because in choice of law rules, you're basically taking the rules of a foreign jurisdiction and you're asking the courts of another one to enforce them. And most courts will do this under a set of rules that we call choice of law rules. So with this package of these three features of the law, you can basically get around most of the public law constraints that are being put in place to contain capitalism time and again. Private actors will use their empowerments through law to find new ways of doing what is now perhaps prohibited or constrained in different ways. And it's the kind of stories that you hear when you talk to lawyers in the big financial centers such as New York or London. They always find a way to mute new regulations by finding legal ways to get around them. It just takes a little longer and it might be a bit more complex. Decentralized access to the means of institutionalized coercion. This is, and on the one hand, you can do strategic litigation yourself, or you can play games when you are being litigated to avoid that there might be a rule change. So a very common practice, certainly in the United States, by big companies is to settle a case. So if you have a class action suit against you, you will settle this before the court comes out with a ruling. If the court never rules, we never have a new precedent, right? So without assuming any liability, companies will pay hundreds of millions of dollars just to settle a case in order to avoid that a judge might make a ruling that will become a new precedent and bind future judges and might kill an entire business structure, entire world of contracts. And so typically they will just see where the judge is going to go, and if the judge might rule against them, they will settle. They will just settle a case. So this is another way in which you can play the game of having access to the means of institutional coercion, but they're basically bribing the other side not ever to get a rule that might be against them. And yet another practice is sort of the expansion of private arbitration. In the US, it's also sanctioned by the Supreme Court now that private arbitration can be in employment contracts and consumer contracts, including depriving consumers and employees of certain procedural rights, such as discovery or class action suits. So these are all mechanisms by which you then deny the other side their access to the means of coercion to build out your power game. So when you think about these three features of capitalist law in their interaction with one another, they tend to reconstitute the system, and they have done so certainly in the post-war era time and again. And so then the question at some point comes, is there an exit? And in my first more realistic or realist approach to this book project, I think I basically said there's no exit. This is how capitalism reconstitutes itself time and again. Before I go on and say something about the transformation, the potential for transformation, let me just say a few words about common law versus civil law, because that comes up very often in these debates. I myself, of course, trained in Germany as a civil lawyer, but I've been teaching for 25 years in the United States in the common law jurisdiction. And yes, these are kind of different beasts. By and large, the civil law system polices the boundary between public and private more carefully than the common law system, and more importantly, it also polices the boundary between contract law and property law more carefully, which means that there are flexible areas of the law that's contract, but once you reach property, you really can't do all that much, not as much as in the common law world. To put it simply, and this might all be Chinese for those who are not lawyers amongst you, but I just want to get this point out. And the real issue that I wanted to mention here is that with globalization, which means opening borders for capital flows, allowing actors to take the law from one jurisdiction and have it enforced in another jurisdiction, being able to pick the law by which you wish to be governed, and this law typically happens to be the law of either England or New York when it comes to global transaction. As a result of that, also civil law systems have been deeply penetrated by the ideas and actually the workings of the common law. So I think it's no longer just the common law where this works, but it's mostly, some aspects of our global transactions, mostly in finance, are deeply penetrated by common law. And in other areas, lawyers have learned the skills when they come to Columbia Law School and many other law schools in the United States. They're being trained in these practices, and they join global law firms, very often owned by US law firms in different jurisdictions, and then transpose their learning, their skills into local law. So I think that the difference between these two legal systems when it comes to capitalist law, to the core areas of capitalist law, is no longer so prominent. But let me come back to how private and public power plays into one another to reinforce it. So if you want to tell the story about this is always how it's going to work and you can't get out, no exit kind of it, then you can see that you use the modules of the code of capital to code capital. Sometimes there will be excesses, there will be crisis, then there will be a public law response that is trying to contain it. And then you use the same elements that you have used to code capital in the first place, you recombine them in ways to get around the new public law constraints, and you do the same game again, in a slightly more complex fashion. So you basically use the private autonomy to get around the public law. You use all this to build out private power, and that private power can also be used for lobbying efforts and other attempts to contain any responses by regulators or the legislature. And this is how the machine basically works. I also wanted to just make the point that the use of private law to code capital and to create sort of these worlds of law that somehow are still tethered to the state in the sense that there is the threat of enforceability, but it's a remote threat because most of the transactions will never be challenged. Most of new inventions in the law happen on the basis of legal opinions written by law firms that say, on the basis of the law that we looked at, this is probably legal, and it won't ever be challenged, right? Given all that, I've used the term, and I'm using it in a different context right now in a new book project, of coded power to describe what law really does. Private law is a form of code that specialists can use to contain and direct the behavior of others. So if you control the means by which societies organize themselves, and private law is a really important one, it's contract law, it's property, it's business organizations, family law, it's inheritance law, it's all that. If you kind of manipulate and can control these rules, you actually have phenomenal control over society. And in a new book project, I'm working with a colleague who is a computer scientist, and we're of course applying these ideas to digitally coded power, so bringing these two things together. So can we transform capitalist law? That was the real challenge, because when I first presented to my faculty at Columbia that there is no exit, even they said, you can't write a book like this. You have to find a way out. So I'm trying. There, of course, are no blueprints. You will understand this from not only what I'm saying, but also from our discussions over the day today. The ways in which capitalism is so deeply entrenched in our systems and so many aspects of our lives. There's no easy way out. I also want to say at the outset that I don't think revolutions are the solution, because revolutions typically change the top tier of the system, but they don't necessarily transform the system from within. You can see this after the French Revolution, the return of inequality within decades to levels that had been seen just before the revolution. You can see this in Russia after the revolution when Lenin had to come back and reintroduce the new economic policy. And it took Stalin and his very oppressive collectivization efforts of the 1930s to transform the system. And if you want this, it's one thing. If you don't want this, and I don't subscribe to these kind of transformations, then I think a revolution is not the way to go. From my point of view, where I say capitalism is actually a legal regime, I also have to then concede that the transformation of capitalism has to come through the law. It has to be a reconfiguration of the law. It has to be basically putting the system on different types of normative foundations. It's not the Renner solution saying we just put new wine into old vessels, but it's an attempt to say we have to reconfigure the very foundations of private law in order to create a different legal systems. So I want to make a couple of arguments here. First of all, it has to be a transformation through law. Most social and institutional transformation happen in incremental steps, but incremental steps doesn't mean that it cannot be transformative. Lots of similar incremental steps can actually transform an entire system, very often more profoundly than radical change. So when you think radical change, you can also think about the radical reforms in Eastern Europe after in the 1990s, after the demise of the socialist system. I think the gradual reform strategy, not that gradual really, but China was obviously much more successful, no matter how you judge the outcome. But the transformation of China was so much deeper, so much more effective than what they tried with radical reforms in Russia. So I'm not a radical reformer by any means. I do believe in incremental change. This also comes from my earlier work on legal transplants. What I want to add to this is that incremental change can happen, and that's the beauty of our private law system. It can happen without new legislative change. Because just as capital has used a relatively open-ended system that can be adapted and made malleable and can be sort of reconfigured for different purposes, so one can do this for other purposes as well. So one has a lot of opportunities to use existing legal principles and laws to put together a different type of legal regime. eventually, so these are basically the first steps, eventually you need more legal reform, institutional reforms that would also think much harder about who would have standing to bring a case in court, who has the final say in a kind of dispute settlement situation, what the law shall be. Is this really, should this be a single judge? Should there be civil, citizen councils? Also there are, I think, reforms, that one could do, but I don't think you would start with them because you won't have the political power to put them through most parliaments or congresses today. The key thing for me is if you think about transformation through incremental steps, you have to also think about what holds this together. So I think there's already a lot of sites in the world in different arenas. We heard about this today in different agricultural settings where people are basically taking this into their own hands and trying something new. And there's a lot of experimentation. Most of this will fizzle out because most of these things fizzle out. But I think if we want to scale them, or if we want to give them a broader meaning, I think one of the things that could potentially hold them together is a kind of a normative shared goals, a similar direction of these change that could then snowball and have a much larger transformative effect. What do I mean by this? So what legal relations do is they create expectations in society about how others will behave in the future. So you want to change these types of expectations, right, if you want to have change. Many laws that we have on the books are actually dormant and haven't been used for a while because in legal practice and the evolution of capitalism, certain types of rules have been used more vigorously than others, and they also have been given a particular interpretation. So there's no reason why, for example, in corporate law, shareholder value maximization should be the governing principle. Even in the United States, this became fashionable only in the 1970s. You can also think of shareholders in a corporation as members of a business organizations, and that sort of changes the equation of thinking about what are the other members, how to think about workers, how to think about consumers, how to think of suppliers in this kind of context. So even within existing legal structures, if you just take out some of the ideology, you can create a different type of legal system. On top of that, what people are increasingly looking at are really dormant provisions in existing law. Some of you might have heard about the socialization of housing campaign in Berlin, Germany. The social democratic government of the city privatized most of the social housing stock in the early 2000s, and of course the big real estate investors came in and they ratcheted up the rents, and now there's an initiative to re-socialize housing. What they're using as the basis for their agenda, they have had one referendum that was successful, but it only asked the Berlin city government to enact such a law, which never happened. They're now doing a second referendum in which basically the people do write the law themselves, which is possible under the Berlin Constitution. And they're invoking Article 15 of the German Basic Law from 1949, which basically says that important resources can be socialized, such as land and also industrial sectors. You have to compensate, but you can socialize. It's a different category from individualized expropriation, but you can socialize housing. The provision has never ever been used in the entire history of the post-war German Republic. But lawyers had to concede that it's still good law on the books. And there's other dormant law in Spain. There's an initiative underway for democratizing work. We just heard about this in the previous session. There's a constitutional provision that says actually the work shall be democratized as well, which the Labour government currently is invoking to perhaps do some reforms. So there are starting points where you could use without having to do the legislative campaigns that seem to be so hopeless right now because the political configurations in our democracies are not are mostly pro-capital. They're still in the neoliberal or worse front. And so I think thinking about how you can use existing norms becomes really important. And then, as I said before, legal arbitrage is a technique that one can easily copy from capital because there are many ways in which you can reconfigure existing law in different ways. I said before that I think radical change rarely, if ever, works. We've done a lot of work over the last couple of decades on the transplant effect. If you just transplant entire new areas of the law, or you try to impose radical change, it mostly is being rejected. So one has to think about the conditions under which there will be change. There's this big literature also in new institutional economics in particular that says institutional change is path dependent. That has been challenged. So there's of course it's one thing to say it's slow. It's another thing to say it's path dependent. That is, that will never sort of veer off of a particular direction, so it will always reinforce itself. Katharina at MIT has done really important work showing how actually incremental change can work within existing formal constraints. And then last but not least, there's also important work done both empirically and theoretically that says when you try to change the system too radically, you get too many rejections. That people will just hold on to what they have rather than moving in a too radical fashion. But what they call the magnet effect works that if you are sufficiently close to the current norms in a society, you get enough people to defect so that those who are trying to be the guardians of these old norms are fearful that they might lose more and might also shift their own normative priors more in this direction. So it's kind of a pull effect, like a magnet, where you're sufficiently close to pull enough supporters to your side to build a broader base for the kind of change that you want. And the example that these authors, Aldashev et al., are using is the equality of women in Western Africa, where after independence, many new independent countries enacted new statutes that granted a lot of liberties for women, was completely ignored. And then in the second or third generation of statutes, they were basically started at a much lower level of ambition, if you want, but were much more successful in getting more change in the pre-existing customary norms on the ground. So these are just sort of the kind of literatures that inform my thinking in trying to develop a strategy for transformative change. I've also thought about whether we've seen incidences of transformative change in legal history in particular, because I'm interested in sort of the formal institutions, how they change. And here just a couple of examples. Most of them go in the direction of producing capitalism as we know it, but I think it's also important to realize that capitalism is the result of many incremental changes, but quite fateful incremental changes. And I think that thinking might also help us in thinking about what are fateful incremental changes that one can work for if one wants to have a different system. One would be the separation of public and private law, which is a child of the Pashukhani says the cities in the Middle Ages, certainly the modern nation state. A second one would be in English law, the convergence of real property and chattel property, movable and immovable. These were two different legal regimes and basically protected land, the most immovable asset, from being treated like a commodity. Once these two converged, land became commodified. The constitutionalization of private autonomy certainly was a fateful, a relatively small change, but in the long term, basically, it basically constricted what constitutional democracies could do. The expansion of private autonomy to legal creatures, legal persons, the corporation, and the legal persons then usurping more and more rights. As you perhaps have heard in the United States, a legal person is not only a real legal person that can contract in its own name and soon be sued in its own name, owns its own asset, but it has the right to the freedom of speech, and even through its owners might invoke religious rights. So the expansion of these rights is quite phenomenal. And then the easing of law's portability, that's basically conflict of law rules that have made it possible for more and more areas of the law to pick and choose the laws by which you wish to be governed. And that basically means for corporations or very wealthy individuals to do so. So I think if you think about sort of when these, what are the critical junctures in law that have made capitalism possible, we can also think about critical junctures in law that might create openings or widen the openings for other forms of social organization. So there are, of course, caveats. One major caveat is that complex systems cannot be directed. So you can have utopias, you can sort of write sort of flow diagrams where you want to go, but complex systems change according to logics that we can't easily control. As the second I mentioned already, the policy of small steps can fizzle out. So we can put a lot of efforts in small little change, and I think we want to have viable models that we can use. But we have to think about what to do with them rather than just allowing them to fizzle out, thinking about how we can make sure that they work in a similar direction and also create information systems so that we can learn about them. we have to realize, of course, that we're up against massive vested interests that are pushing against that and are doing exactly the opposite from what I'm saying as we speak on every front, whether it's antitrust law or corporate law or big tech with its contracting forms, etc. A real problem also is that I think because of the effects of climate change and other factors, but that's an additional one, there's so much stress on societies that is increasing over time, which makes them much less amenable to experimentation and openness. And so I think this is just a factor you have to take in. Of course, on top of that is the politicization of so many aspects of our lives, but I think that is a stress factor that is working against sort of new openings. But there's still hope, I think, in that sort of the ingenuity of humans and also the, I think, empathy without which we wouldn't have survived as a species for all our for all the horrible things that we've done to one another. It's still, I think, it's still a feature of human societies. So let me just sort of close by explaining a little bit on how I would think about a transformation of capitalist law. And I'm basically fuzzy about what comes after it, but I want to say transformation, which is real change. So it's not just a little reformist step, but a transformation that I think would move beyond calling the system capitalist. If you take my definition seriously by saying this is a system that allows private actors to use social resources to create private power and gain, right? So if we change that system, that this is no longer possible in the same way. I think the first fundamental step that I think one would need to make is sort of to ensure that the experiments and the reform directions have kind of a shared normative agenda. And I give here one example, it's not the only example, but one that I think also matches up with the magnet effect that I described earlier, which is the capabilities approach. And I chose it for two reasons. Capabilities is sort of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum saying it's an individualized approach, but it says every person in the world has the right to choose the life that he or she has reasons to value. So it puts the individual in the center, which I think also makes sense in the sense that if individuals are the most vulnerable elements of any kind of society, but it doesn't give them the kind of autonomy and claim to autonomy that our current legal order does. At the same time, I think it picks up many people who have a highly individualized approach to their ideas about how societies shall work, and therefore you could maybe through the magnet effect bring them on board. With a Trojan horse effect, which is really the most important aspect for me about the capabilities approach, certainly in the rendering by Martha Nussbaum, and that is the claim to have the conditions so I can live the rights that I have reason to value is not just against the state, it's against everyone. And it's not against only our neighbors, but against corporations and also multinational corporations. That means what I want is basically claim that against other private actors. And that would overcome our division of public and private law as having two fundamentally different normative foundations. The private law is saying private autonomy, if you can get somebody else to consent or you can get the authority to use something as property, you can do whatever you want, up to the limit of fraud and abuse, and in between, just, it's your freedom kind of thing. When you think about capabilities, it's a much more limited approach because you have to respect, and you can be called to respect the rights of others. Again, we don't have all the institutions for this right now, but I'm happy in the Q&A to give you examples for how this might work in practice. So I think because of the proximity to our individualized rights approach, it might find many more followers than more radical approaches would, and therefore has a transformative potential because it does build in a different direction of the claims than what we have been used to. There are intermediate steps that have been proposed, some of which I also discuss in my book. Martin Hesselink, who is a legal theorist who works in Italy right now at the European Law Institute, he has suggested in response to my Code of Capital to write something like a just private law code, like a soft code that announces the principles by which private law should be interpreted. I'm a little bit of a skeptic of soft codes because they very often they give you the pretense that something has been done, but nothing really has been done. but at the same time, they give us an opportunity to articulate on our normative principles. So I think as an intermediate step, I think it's a good idea. There's case law that already points in direction. Some of the case law that's coming out, even out of courts like the Supreme Court in the UK, that one could cite as an example for a new direction in the interpretation of private law. Then, of course, in the end, it's not just about law and institutions, it's of course also about social mobilization. And I don't want to say there's a clear sequence between the two. I think they probably have to go together. But it has to be social mobilization, I think, is more effective if there is actually an avenue to change, for change. And I think finding these change junctures, the potential junctures in the existing legal system, might be a good way also to mobilize people. One problem, of course, and I have to concede this too, few people get really excited about private law. There are no public debates about private law. That's one of the problems. It's not as bad as finance, but banking, of course, is one of the most opaque areas of the law, and nobody really talks about it. And private law, too, never ever, galvanizes people. It should, because I think it's the most important way of ordering social relations that is also largely in our hands if we want to use it ourselves. Okay, so let me just maybe finish here and take questions and see whether we can clarify some of the issues I haven't addressed. Thank you.
Oh, there's a lot of questions already. Bien, tenemos 1, 2, 3 y 4 para empezar. Bien, 5 para continuar. El micrófono, por favor. Sí. Gino primero. Gino, aquí. Okay. Adelante. Sí.
Sure.
Okay. I wanted to make the question in English, just so you don't have to use
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean question, but it's actually like several things that I was thinking about while you were talking. And I guess the most striking thing for me was when you mentioned how you don't believe that revolutions can be a way to fix capitalist problems. I guess starting from the point that you're mentioning how you understand capitalism more as a legal regime than anything else, right? And I guess what was striking to me is that what you're mentioning, this kind of transformation of legal codes, doesn't seem to be mutually exclusive with revolutionary processes, right? Like you mentioned China, and you can think about how in China you have both a revolution that it's kind of like the starting point to what China is today, and also this transformation of law that happens over time and that has the strength, unlike other countries, to, through this revolution, get, let's say, a direction for this transformation process in the legal system, right? Because you mentioned by the end, in your conclusions, that a caveat with the way these transformations are proposed is that small changes can fizzle out, right? But if you have a revolutionary process going on through, I don't know, like strategies such as planned economies, these 5-year plans that are the thing in China, right? You get a direction that makes it so these changes cannot fizzle out over time, right? They actually give a horizon that needs to be fulfilled after a time, and that actually makes it possible so these transformations can have meaningful impact, right? Because the problem, as you already mentioned, is that if we only depend on existing conditions, these transformation processes are really, really fragile, right? And I think, especially in countries like Peru, but I think it's any capitalist country, the way laws are made, the way bills are passed and whatever, is not entirely dependent on like rational arguments that are exchanged between congressmen or lawmakers or whatever, right? It does have to do a lot with where is the money, right? Who is funding this party, who is funding this specific lawmaker, etc., right? So in that way, it kind of seems like what would be more beneficial to your proposal would be to have a revolutionary program backing it, because in that way, it would actually be effective and avoid this risk of just fizzling over time. So I guess the question with you is, what do you think of it?
Yeah. Can I?
To collect a couple of questions,
If
or
you
want to answer?
I mean, this was a pretty long one, so
Okay,
I wonder if I
go
don't
ahead.
mind. Sorry. So I think it's easier. It's also late in the day, and so to remember them. So, you know, I do agree that if you have a clear program and you can set directions in a certain way, you're more likely to chart that course in a certain way. The question is how many people you really bring along. I'm not sure what you mean by the China Revolution. I mean, China since 1978 was basically a move away from the revolution. And it has carried over some of the features of the old system, which would be a 5-year plan, but almost everything is no longer there. China is a capitalist society run by a communist party today. And I think China's success, in my view, and I've studied some of that, is that it has actually allowed a very decentralized process of experimentation and put people in charge. I think the governance mechanism was not so much like an ideology. I think, you know, Deng Xiaoping said, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but they used the human resource management of their bureaucrats to say, you get advanced if your economy prospers in the region where you are in charge. And they experimented. They have the township and village enterprise, that all kinds of new forms of organization. And once something came up that worked, then you had the Communist Party at the top to say, we will generalize that. So you have a structure, and I agree with you on that point, you had a structure that survived from the old communist China into the new kind of more capitalist China that was sort of doing the selection and the generalization to some extent. Whether the generalization always worked is a different matter. And I think in that sense, having sort of some kind of an authority, some kind of an agent that says this is the way we go, but they didn't set I think the agenda from the get-go. They did also a lot of experimentation. So if that's the kind of revolution we're talking about, I'm fine. I think we just have to then define what we mean with it. I think just a regime change will never do the trick. I think what we need is sort of a common denominator, and you're saying it has to come from the top, basically, and I'm saying it could also come from a normative commitment to ensure that, you know, this is what we're trying to do. We're really helping people to live a particular type of life, and that can be done in all kinds of different ways because it is context specific, and it's very also cultural specific in different contexts. So I think there are different strategies, but I don't think we necessarily disagree on the fundamentals.
Okay, muchas gracias. Joaquín, después.
Thank you for your conference. I will also try to make my question in English, and my question is very similar to Gino's, but it's less specific because when I was reading your previous book and listening this talk, I was thinking that this, especially today, these incremental changes and presuppose the ability to do these incremental changes presuppose that we have the power to do it. But all the argument I get is of the previous book is the power is in the hand of the people who has capital, and the people who has capital can hire these code masters who are able to battle every change we try to make. So in a sense, to make incremental changes, we need to grasp the power to make it and sustain them in time. So that's a kind of a striking thing to me. So how can we grab the power with incremental changes?
So I think there are different strategies here. One is, and I still stand to what I said in the coding of capital, if you have the best lawyers, you can code all kinds of capital, you can get around legal constraints. At the same time, I also want to stress that the laws that we have on the books, and this is also, we don't need to lobby for legislative change. It's something I want to say in response to your remarks as well. I'm not talking about going to the parliament in Lima or anywhere else, to Congress. You don't get anything through Congress right now. They're shutting down the government. I mean, it's impossible. Our legislative processes are no longer working really. What I'm talking about, we have tons and tons and tons of laws on the books, and they can be used in all kinds of different ways. So when I go and talk to the, let's say, the co-op movement in the US, and there are some viable co-ops, I would say. The co-op movement in the US, they have figured out there are many states that don't have a viable co-op statute because they're agriculture co-ops that were last amended in the 1950s. You can use the most contractual of all, maybe most capitalist of all statutes, the Delaware Limited Liability Statute, and you can create a really viable co-op with this because everything is contractual. You just have to write that contract. Now, you might still need a lawyer, but there are people who do this for much less money than the folks in the big firms in New York. So there is a lot of legal imagination that you can do to reorder society. You don't, when you come face to face in a conflict with the big power wielders, you will probably lose, but not always and necessarily. I'll give you an example in a second. But in terms of self-ordering, finding modes of how you can reorganize your life in different ways, there are many ways in which you can do this. You can do this, of course, outside the law, but if you need the law because you want to have limited liability, or you want to have like prefab kind of modes of social ordering, there's stuff there. And there's actually more on the pipeline because many states and jurisdictions are adopting new stewardship, ownership structures and things like that. One good example, just sometimes, David wins against Goliath, although it can take a long time. You probably have heard about the Shell case in the UK Supreme Court, and it's a double-edged sword, no doubt, but a Shell subsidiary in Nigeria polluted the water of the fishermen, and they just were deprived of their sustenance. And some, of course, human rights lawyers picked up these cases and fought them all the way to the Supreme Court in the UK. They litigated in the UK, they also litigated in The Hague. And of course, Shell tried everything, every trick in the rule book. They don't have standing, one father had died and the son can't represent everything. In the end, and then of course, in the end, they were able to sue. And then it comes to the real legal argument. Will the parent company be responsible for the damages done by the subsidiary? And the standard corporate law theories in most jurisdictions say no, because the legal subsidiary is legally separate. It's a separate legal entity, even though the Shell parent company owns 100% of the shares. It's still formally separate, and Shell parent will be responsible only if you can show that they abuse the form somehow. And the Supreme Court in England said no, they had already developed a case law along those lines and said basically parents are responsible for their children. What they used was the old duty of care, fiduciary duties. You owe a duty of care to the customers and people around, even your subsidiary, and invoke liability. Now, the fishermen themselves are not necessarily happy because it took 15 years and the payoffs were not nothing, but they were maybe not substantially enough for what they had suffered. The legal change is remarkable. That's sort of a new avenue for lawyers to go after and saying, actually, we have not only this very formalistic idea of separate legal personality, but we have fiduciary duties and other legal principles that we can invoke. And it didn't cost you the global 100 law firms kind of fees. It was done by some human rights lawyers. So there are signs of hope. They're small, but I would still want to draw them out and put them up here.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Pistor, for your thoughts and for sharing your work with us. And my question is about central bank independence, because you said that we talked too little about private law entities, and I think, or public law, because, the central bank, it's a public institution, but it's private, deep inside. So I would like to raise a question about how much can we push the democracy in the central banks? Because, for example, here in Peru, we praise, I think, too much the independence of the Peruvian central bank just because it's effective in the economic side. But when we have established in the Constitution that the only goal of the central bank is price stability, how much can we push this goal? There is no words about employment or unemployment or other issues that central banks are involved, because mortgages or taxes and everything, well, taxes not, because that's the Ministry of Finance, but I mean, how much can we push these incremental changes or institutional changes in this basic institution that, I mean, copes everything like the central bank?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you that central bank independence has brought us not only a technocratic monetary system, but one that is very much biased in favor of the banks, which has a lot to do with the fact that also our entire monetary system is deeply entrenched with private money creation through the banking system. So I think the problems go much deeper than just central bank independence. On the banking and financial side, since Gianfranco was mentioned my Adorno lectures, I just gave a series of lectures on the nature of money and the money system and the constitution of money that we have. I think that's one of the systems where more radical change might be feasible than in the law, because it's also a different system. I mean, the legal system is really basically so deep in all our social relations that getting them out that, changing them from one to the other day to the other is really, it's difficult. I think there are junctures where one can push better and it can transform, but I think it's a much more filigrane, sort of capillary, Foucault would say, capillary system of formal relations. I hate to say this because I don't want to have the results of, but this is like the revolutionary moment could be the next financial crisis. And I think that another major financial crisis should give us an opportunity to really fundamentally rethink the way that we organize money domestically and globally. And I think for countries like Peru, I think there are two things. One is, how much do you really want to be exposed to international monetary systems that you can't control? And the second, within your own country, how can you organize a system that actually delivers money and access to money resources to all and not only to some, by a system that is so much geared towards a profit-driven money system? I think all societies should ask these kind of questions. But I think if you change them, we've had sort of monetary reforms. I think they're more successful to change the system in relatively short order, because they change the chutes. It's like it's the plumbing of the system. You just open the chutes in a different direction. That's sort of I think that there I would see more potential for more radical change than in the law itself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, adelante, Fabio. Teníamos a él, luego Anuncio y luego Diego, ¿no? No. Aquí adelante, sí, el señor de verde, por favor. Luego.
Thanks. I think there can be an argument for, or a case in which radical transformation is preferable than slow transformation, which is climate change, in the face that we are pressed by time, by the imminent crossing of planetary boundaries that is so close to our time. So, of course, I appreciate your remarks. I don't think that a transformation of the law in order to save us from climate catastrophe would not have any resistance. I think it will have resistance, especially from the ones that will be affected by them, which I think are global north consumers. Recently read a paper which found out that most global north consumers wouldn't bother to change their consumption styles in order to help the environment to prevent climate change. So I think you're right to point out that a radical transformation of a law would be probably violent, but I really don't think there is an option to that. I think that the only way to save us from climate catastrophe in that case is to have more of a Lenin-style transformation of the law than an incremental one.
You know, it's hard to disagree with sort of, if you want to have real change by 2030 or even 2050, incremental change won't do it. Certainly the current politics of COP30 or whatever it is will not do the trick. I'm less positive than you are that a Lenin-style thing intervention will do the trick. I mean, you must assume that you basically get a world ruler in place that can stop all the natural resource companies further extracting resources or burning CO2 and stop consumption patterns from one day to the other. I mean, we have seen, of course, shocks like during COVID when you can basically clamp down on global trade from one day to the other. So in emergency situation that is being done. But we can also see with Russian sanctions how this is being evaded immediately. So I can't see that this is an easy solution to anything. You can shoot these people, but the structures are still there, and other people will, step into their shoes. So I don't think it's a solution, to be entirely frank with you. And so I think the more realistic perspective for me is sort of to try to get real change, and will not happen by 2030, neither by 2050, but by 2050 we might have enough models of change, enough works done by many people that we are on a somewhat different path, at a different temperature and with much more precarity for many people around the world, I grant you that.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I have 3 questions. I try to say quickly. The first is about the main feature of capitalism. No? If I understand, they are present in all forms of capitalism. And this is my question, because capitalism is one general form, but there is a different form. The USA laissez-faire capitalism is different than Italian corporative capitalism. And China is a capitalist society, but it's very different. And there is a control of the state, some form of planified economy. And so my question is, maybe the 3 main features are present in all this form, but they change the degree, maybe, of one of them. For example, the private empowerment is less present or less important in China. This is my understanding question. The second is about revolution or radical. I don't want to repeat what the other said, but I think that I agree with you about the problem of revolution. One of the main problems besides the violence is that you don't have the process of learning when you made something so big. So this is one, and the other is have the political support to do the revolution. But I disagree with you when you associate the radical solution maybe with revolution, because there is some 2 historical examples that I know with radical change that work. Was the New Deal in the United States was radical. It then imply a fight between political institution, Roosevelt, and the Supreme Court. Was a legal fight, And this one example, and the other is welfare state, for example, in Europe. And it's not surprising that this radical change comes from shock, from crisis. The economic crisis in 1929 and the Second World War. So I think that there is a sample radical that doesn't assume violence and doesn't assume experimentation. But I think that we need some radical strategy for political support, for what you say at the end, for social mobilization, because otherwise it's difficult with this incremental change have political support to overcome the bargain power of elite, company, and so on. So because you have sometimes you need some realistic utopistic horizon, to give to people. So the final question is, if I understand your reply, it seems to me that your strategy is not only incremental, but also is not institutional, if I understand, in the sense that you answer from the proper plutocracy. You said, no, parliament doesn't work. In the United States is a plutocracy. And you say, no, I am thinking about a different way to change the law. And if I understand, you imagine this kind of change that happened with civil mobilization through the court, no? But I think there is two problems. One is to depend of the judge, you know? For example, in Supreme Court in the United States now is a problem because there is a majority of judges that have this original interpretation, and independent is the country is conservative or not. And the other problem is the coordination. Because when you imagine this kind of change, there isn't any coordination between social, civil engagement. And this is one of the problems, because I think that you need institution to change the law. So this is my reservation. And just final about the capability approach, if I understand, I see because you like a capability approach because it's not institution. No? You mentioned the fact that it's a relation, but I think that is the weakened point of capability approach. So it's linked with your, if I understand correctly.
Okay, thank you for this. So yeah, yes, there are variations on capitalism. They've always been, the question, of course, do you generalize, you step back, or you go into the details? So, the models in continental Europe are very different from England and the US. As I said before, I think when it comes to global capitalism, and especially capital and capital flows, it's deeply, deeply common law nowadays. I mean, most of the traded financial instruments in the world are coded either English law or New York law, which doesn't mean that you can't have companies in northern Italy that work very, very differently from a big corporation in the United States. But also in the United States, you can find co-ops that use the Delaware limited liability companies that you work also completely different from that. So I think when I overgeneralize, I'm basically talking about the logics of a capitalist system, and the US is the most extreme, right? I think many European countries have lost their way as well, I think, in the last 20, 30 years, and in sort of the competition, and also the politically driven attempt to be like them. When you just look at what happened in the European Parliament, just with the right wing and centrists getting together and softening the green standards to be competitive and basically do the neoliberal project. After in the United States we actually no longer do this, but now Europe is trying to catch up with this. So there's so there are variations, but I think the logic and the trends, I think, are in my view, is a little bit stronger. I think I did say in the response to the central bank that you can actually have radical change without a revolution, right? So you can have radical change. The question is, in what areas of the law can you easily implement radical change? And I do think that the financial and money system are easier to change than the intricacies of a complex legal system. You can, so I think one example, I think most of our power relations today are deeply structured in contracts, not property. So you can abolish property. People are writing about this, and I think Axel Honneth is also a fan of reforming property rights. But today, with information technology, you can, through contracts, control millions of people that all have to abide by your contract, right? You will not abolish contracts. It's one of the most the simplest way in which we can sort of make agreements and organize our lives. Makes perfect sense. You have to abolish certain things, boilerplate contracts, or you have to think about it, whether you enforce them or not. There are lots of ways in which you can do something about them, but you can't just abolish the thing. You could shift, however, I think, the way we create money. It would have major repercussions. On the welfare state, I think the welfare state was actually maybe a radical change, but an anti-revolutionary change. If you think about the history of the welfare state in Germany in the 19th century, it was Bismarck who wanted to make sure that the Social Democrats or the Labor would not mount a revolution against him. What I didn't quite understand is the question of you need institutions for having legal change. I mean, institutions, when you go to Douglas North's definition, are the rules of the game. They can come in all kinds of different forms. What I'm basically saying is that our system is deeply organized through formal institutions, that they give you really a stronghold over power. You don't need to go to a court for every formal institutions that you use, right? If challenged, if there's a conflict, you have to, and then you face the problems that you just mentioned. We can do a lot of stuff outside courts, contracts, business organizations. We can organize our lives in many, many different ways with existing law without having to do any of a direct confrontation. When you have to go to, and I think, I do put some weight on courts more than on legislatures because it's a decentralized institution and it can be responsive. The US Supreme Court is a huge problem today. I totally agree with you. But there are many, many appeal courts that are doing exactly the right thing at the same time. So you know, it's a judgment call in the end. You need some basically authorities that say this is right or wrong. Are we going this direction or that direction? That you need. And you can say these are the legislatures at different levels, or you can say these are the courts, or these are the politicians, but then they, you know, like Mamdani in New York, he gains power, then let's see what he can do within that system, right? But I think in the end you have to find the entry point to change the system in some direction that has then a repercussion effect. But I don't see that the system can be like swung around just from one day to the other like this.
Thank you for your presentation. I will read my question to you. One of the most debated demands within the broader popular sphere is a call for a constituent assembly. From your previous book, The Code of Capital, I understand that a significant part of capitalist domination stems from private law and from a set of legal arrangements that can be configured in highly advantageous ways for those with the skill to do so. Does this suggest that the Peruvian social movement's struggle for a constituent assembly is in some sense trapped or limited by these dynamics?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think it goes to the point, you know, that Pashokanis made, like the kind of tension or antithesis between our public and private law. We think about constitutive assemblies for creating a new constitution that create our public law institutions. Who can adopt the law? You know, what is the division of power between the judiciary and the legislature? But nobody talks about property and contracts and business organization law. In fact, all these laws existed at the time when our constitutions were written, and they were simply taken on board with no change. On top of that, we basically say we protect property without, in most constitutions, even defining what property is or who might have the power to define it, right? So if you go down that path of a constitutive assembly, I would say, well, then this should be part of it. Who defines what is property? Who defines it? What can we do? It doesn't save you from everything. So I give you an example. The German constitution says in Article 14 that the scope and limits of property rights are defined by the legislature. Americans find this completely socialist. It hasn't prevented Germany from going down the, you know, path of neoliberalism either, right? But there have been some incidents where you can say that the legislature actually used this power and defined in the courts and said, no, this is not expropriation, so you will not be compensated, because all the legislature did is define the scope and limit of property. But the push of my argument is basically to say I want to have a similar normative foundation for public or constitutional law and private law. I'm basically pushing the normative side. If I understand your question correctly, you could also say, let's have a new constitutive assembly and say, let's just write a constitution that sort of somehow brings these two normative principles together, right?
Okay. Pues, Sebastián y luego Trilce. Ok. Sebastián. Bueno, como sea más fácil.
Gracias. Espero no haya un problema con que pueda darlo en castellano. Mi inglés no es tan sofisticado. Creo que sería un poco más cómodo poder decirlo en castellano. Quería extender un poco tal vez las críticas que habías dado con respecto a la capacidad o la posibilidad, digamos, de pensar en reformas revolucionarias de los problemas que hemos estado discutiendo. Siento que hay una contradicción. Yo también tuve la oportunidad de leer el anterior libro que publicaste y, digamos, estoy de acuerdo en buena parte con los diagnósticos que realizas, y a mí me llamó la atención cómo reconoces e identificas bastante bien que la tendencia histórica ha ido hacia la concentración de riqueza y, digamos, y cómo esa riqueza luego es capaz de movilizarse sobre quienes codifican el capital y quienes además dominan el conocimiento para poder operar sobre él. Pareciera que, digamos, ahorita estamos más bien en un momento en que se está disparando incluso más tanto la concentración de la riqueza como la forma en la que el derecho puede emplearse, ¿no?, al servicio del capital. Entonces, yo no sé cómo va a avanzar el futuro. No dudo de que haya formas de discutir, digamos, posibilidades de reformas graduales, progresivas, pero pareciera que, al menos en el libro y en la exposición que te he escuchado, hay como casi una petición de fe, como das algunos ejemplos muy concretos a lo largo de las últimas décadas, pero no son, digamos, propuestas que se hayan articulado sistemáticamente y que parecieran que podemos virar al menos con los fundamentos que tenemos hoy en día. No estoy de acuerdo con la caracterización de China como una economía capitalista, cuando menos diría que es híbrido. No voy a explayarme sobre cómo hay un porcentaje de empresas públicas con medios estatizados o cómo el sector privado, digamos, tiene incluso participación del Estado que es significativa incluso en las mesas directivas, como eso creo que se desvió un poco, pero sí hay esta observación sobre cómo, no sé, hoy en día los teóricos de la oligarquía a nivel global y sobre todo en Estados Unidos, pienso en Jeffrey Winters, reconocen sobre cómo los mecanismos procedimentales de las democracias representativas están erosionando. O sea, hay una captura del Estado que pareciera seguir expandiéndose. Entonces, yo entiendo por qué algunos compañeros, digamos, toman como referente lo que sucede hoy en día en China, en tanto que el sector privado no tiene la capacidad para erosionar, degenerar, explotar, digamos, los mecanismos institucionales del Estado ni del derecho, como por ejemplo pasa en Estados Unidos, que hoy en día tienes, no sé, tienes dos partidos, pero ambos partidos están completamente, tienen un lobby increíble que impiden que un conjunto de políticas públicas que son muy populares, como incluso los chequeos preventivos en tenencia de armas, con cosas básicas se puedan implementar por más que tienen más de 80% de aprobación. O sea, hay verdaderos problemas básicos a nivel de si existe o no existe una soberanía popular, en contraste con cómo en China, digamos, sí hay una recepción, a mí me parece mucho más eficaz y más representativa de políticas públicas que son populares, incluso ahorita su cambio de energía fósiles a renovables ha sido completamente eficaz y muy popular, incluso con medios independientes que han estado midiendo las opiniones de la ciudadanía en un país que tiene 1.000 millones de población, un número casi 1.000 millones, un número impresionante. Entonces, yo queriendo ahorita precisar si es que cuando estás recomendando estas formas progresivas, estas formas en que tenemos que comenzar a empujarlas, es, digamos, no sé si se te ocurren concretos en que se haya articulado de forma sistemática, al menos a nivel nacional, para poder, digamos, suscribir esto como una posibilidad real, que sienta que es, digamos, no solamente algo que yo desearía creer porque, no sé, como por pura esperanza, por ser optimista, sino, digamos, porque hay precedentes históricos que se pueden impulsar, porque a nivel global siento que la tendencia más bien es la inversa y si entiendes el momento revolucionario como un momento de irrupción y redirección, desconociendo los fundamentos básicos del sistema previo, como ciertamente también fue en China con el ascenso del PCCH después de la guerra civil con el Kuomintang, tienes, digamos, no las respuestas inmediatas, tienes un proceso de aprendizaje gradual, pero ciertamente has eliminado los obstáculos estructurales y has facilitado que en el mediano a largo plazo haya las reformas de base que hoy en día creo que hacen que China tenga, no solamente pasó de ser el país más pobre del mundo por PBI per cápita en los 70, sino que hoy en día está con indicadores, digamos, de calidad de vida que son impresionantes. Incluso el año pasado la economía ha crecido mientras los billonarios se reduce en China, me parece una tendencia, el único caso a nivel global donde eso es un caso. Entonces, yo ni siquiera diciendo de que es una medida que se tenga que exportar, pero simplemente diciendo que es una posibilidad, que me parece que es un camino con méritos, con éxitos, que es una posibilidad que se abre entre muchas y eso sí quiero al menos reconocer que es una posibilidad y ahora al momento de sopesar cuál es mejor, no quiero simplemente quedarme, es una esperanza que yo tengo porque quiero creerla, quiero como construir fundamentos un poco más duros, porque si no, de momento pareciera que los argumentos que más me persuaden están en ese modelo, que igual va a disputarse en discusiones públicas, porque ya se vienen discutiendo en los últimos años. Entonces quería saber tus impresiones y también si me podías como dar un poco más de fundamento sobre por qué creer en esta medida progresiva desde el sistema que ya estamos habitando. Gracias.
Thank you. So we may have a separate conversation about China, because I think we can have different interpretation. I just want to insist that it's not a representative government. It might sometimes represent the will of the people, but you have to live with with the idea of a benevolent authoritarian structure. And that's something I'm not very sympathetic to, but we can discuss this outside. Let me just go back to the other points, and I have to get rid of this, because I think I can, what I hear you saying is, give me a strategy, give me utopia, don't give me just like incremental change. Let me just try to restate the argument that I'm making. We have in the capitalist legal system a fundamental struggle between the public and the private law. And what we've been trying to do in the past, time and again, we have the capitalist system going overboard by an excessive use of the powers that private law vests with capitalists, and we use public law to rein it in. We use public regulation, we use fines, we use sometimes taxation, but taxation is completely out of vogue. But so that sort of state is trying to rein in the capitalist system, and I would say this project has failed. No, this project has failed because capitalism has always come back through the mechanisms that I'm describing. So then you can say, what are the solutions? Either the state completely takes over, the current state. So there may be three solutions. One is the state takes over the capitalist system. The second is the capitalist system takes over the state. I think that's the model we're currently living through in the United States, right? And the third is to say we actually want to put the private law system on the same foundations that we would put our collective self-governance on. And I still believe more in the self-governance of people rather than in benevolent rulers. And then the question is how we do this. And so it's the third avenue that I'm arguing for. I don't like either of the other two, and so I'm basically saying one way in which we could make progress is to say we want to use the system of self-ordering that we have in private spheres. Forget about the political system, I'm not touching that in my book, and I'm also not really competent in this, but if you say it's all in the public system or the political system, then I would have to write a completely different book. But I'm basically saying within the system that I know, the private law system has potential, but has to be put on very different normative foundations, and that's sort of the kind of direction that I want to take, not the China direction.
Okay.
Yes, but the translators can't. Yes.
So thank you so much for your presentation. I was thinking about this concept of code of capital around a context of EUDR, which is the new regulation of the EU on specific crops in order to tackle deforestation, right? And I work with cooperatives that produce coffee in Peru and in other regions. But something that is quite interesting to look at is how we continue on having this hierarchy of global north determining the regulations linked to climate change, for instance, that are supposed to be radical but are actually not, because they are reproducing a hierarchy in which we will continue on extracting information, data, in order to comply to a regulation that is determined by something as key as profiting from a crop, right? That it gets exported to the EU in this case. And I was thinking about what do you think are the legal frameworks or legal changes that we should be thinking of in this context of regulations, and also on thinking about like data as capital, and if we can kind of recode this thinking of how did you say it? The coded power, since this regulation also entails farmers and smallholders gathering their information in order to comply to the regulation, and then not doing much more with it. Mm-hmm. So it's just extracting information, and it's not, like really returning. Yeah. And on the other hand, you also can see the power of data and actually owning and governing the data, personal and collective, in order to challenge this hierarchy of extractivism, right? So I was thinking if we could possibly look at it.
Yeah, so I don't know the details of this regulation, but I think the pattern, the pattern sounds familiar again, right? So, and I think it's an example for two or three things. One example is also how deeply existing governments are entrenched with capitalist powers, right? And how they sometimes do their bidding by extracting certain information or doing other things that play in the hand of capital. So I think in finance in general, in the money system that we currently have, in many other areas, in the tax system, and I think in data as well, we have far too much collusion between the government and the private sector. Again, which is why I have more faith in individuals and associations than I do have in many governments around the world. But another point I wanted to make is it goes directly to the data and also the attempts of, I also know peasant organizations in Vermont and New England who are having similar issues. They've collected data to try to heal the land, and now Wall Street basically comes and is trying to get the data from them to monetize this or to use their land as simply a credit offset or climate offset, so they can pollute with that. So I think there is an extraction of new forms of capital data, because once you enclose them, you can put them on a device, you control them, you can claim them as yours, and then you can monetize them by selling them to others or creating new types of assets from them. So it's the same patterns, basically enclose, extract, exhaust, and move on. But the beautiful thing about data is that you can't ever exhaust them. There will always be more. And then I think the additional pernicious thing is that sort of collecting data on the land is actually quite time-consuming. It's not just us sitting at a computer and doing some stuff and they collect our data, but it's a real attempt to create knowledge about a certain space. And if that basically gets extracted, that's, for me, a form of expropriation. But unfortunately, again, this is a complete failure of our governments. Nobody had the idea of entrenching our rights to our data or collective rights to collectively gathered data as property rights that should be defendable against these kind of attacks. They're not. As long as they're out there and somebody can grab them, they're treated like wild animal. You shoot them, you capture them, then they're theirs, then they're yours. And so I think it's a recursive pattern, but I think it's pernicious and it puts many of the peasant groups in a very bad situation. What they think they need to do is they have to find ways, both in technology and law, to protect their data against outside incursions.
Bien, tenemos tiempo todavía para algunas cuantas preguntas más, si las hubiera. O repreguntas, y no, muy bien. Y luego Fabián. Sí.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I just wanted to insist, I guess, on the
on China.
on more so than China, the idea of revolution, I guess, because yeah, when you answered, you mentioned this maybe way of differentiating between revolution as just a regime change and then as more like a structural transformation, right? And I think when we think of regime changes, we're just thinking of coups, right? Coup d'etat, like, and I would say then that we have to think of revolutions more as processes, right? That at least, let's say, set a goal, direction for a society to go in, and in that sense, do make way for, let's say, or like it supports at least, or gives the basis for different agents within a society to propose alternatives to the system, to existing systems, right? The thing you mentioned about experimentation, that I think it's great, yeah, it's the direction we should go in, but that I think can only work within that kind of like central structure, because if not, again, it just fizzles out, right? It just reminds me of this novel by Emmanuel Carrera, I don't know if anyone else has read it, of Other Lives Than Mine, or Other Lives Than My Own, something like that, which tells the story of two lawyers in France that just go around their days trying to help people that are going to be evicted just by twisting existing property and capitalist laws. And it's really nice and it's a really touching story, but then they die and it just doesn't transcend more than that, right? So in that sense, I would just insist, like, how to make this have a lasting impact if we are not able to organize in a way that gives us, again, a goal, a purpose that I think can be achieved, especially through the form of a political party. Someone mentioned Lenin, and I think that's what we should that's what we should rescue, let's say, from Lenin, the idea of the political party as a structure that centralizes ideals and new directions for society, and then make them reality through, well, revolution or whatever it is, but at least a way of transformation, right? Without that, I think it just is doomed to fail, to be honest.
So that might be right. So I think, and I'm not against anybody sort of using a political movement or a political party to try to change something and to mobilize people for a particular idea that they have to formulate and then sell to their members and the electorate. I have to say that I also, was positively surprised by how Mamdani in New York within a couple of months was able to mobilize people for something as simple as saying, actually, we want to reduce, make it possible to live in New York at some kind of decent cost. Very simple idea. But I think that's also the kind of idea that galvanizes lots of people. And I don't think it's so much different from what I'm saying if I use the capabilities approach and say every person should have the right to live the lives that she has reason to value. And but that claim is not only so you have to also think about how to implement this change. So you get this government in place. What does this government do? How long does it take to trickle down so that anybody on the ground actually has any sort of benefit from this? You have to change, if you change the system from above, you also have to think through the institutional changes that you have to put in place to change the system in this particular way. You can take the sledgehammer, some of that the Trump administration is already doing for us, such as destroying the system, but maybe the bad part, not the good part, or from whatever perspective you want to look at this. You can do this, you can always destroy. Rebuilding is a really complicated thing. And so I don't think that it's necessarily easier to first have the political movement, try to build this party, try to get power in the state and then implement these reforms all the way down, as opposed to saying let's create movements from the ground up that share a common ideal. This is what I'm saying, what you need, a glue that holds it together. In the old days, in old sort of kind of radical reformative movements, these were family ties that held it together. We don't have this, so we need a normative foundations. That's what I'm advocating for. And I'm not sure that either of that the one is necessarily more effective or more easily to accomplish than the other. I'm not saying it should be, I have a favor for one than over the other, but I think I'm open to political change if that change is possible. I just don't see many possibilities for it right now.
Fabián, y luego usted atrás, y luego usted y Sebastián después. Okay. Sobre China. Okay.
Hello. It's me again. I will try to put this question on the line of your presentation about the possibilities of social change, but I'm still thinking on the code of capital. And if I'm not wrong, I remember that at the end of the chapter 1, you said that the progressive loss of belief in the authority of law is representing a big threat to the capital. And I just want to know how this thought can develop. I feel like this is the continuation of that thought, but I also still thinking about the other conferences that we had and the discussions about informal economy, for example, and if that these discussions and these realities are part of the things that you were thinking when you're thinking about the progressive loss of faith. And if this progressive loss of faith on the authority of law does not deliver people to start attitudes of disobedience, and probably not a revolution, but some of chaotic moment of not fatal establishment. I mean.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. So I still stand to this proposition that, because I'm saying capitalist is a legal regime, capitalists benefit from a particular way that they have coded the law. right? And without everybody else kind of believing that if it's legal, it's fine, they wouldn't have the kind of legitimacy to do what they are doing currently, right? So I think that's still true, which doesn't mean that only that type of capitalist law is the law that might exist or should even exist, right? So you can describe how law has been usurped by the capitalist class in a particular way and critique it, but this doesn't exclude me from basically saying there could be a different law. There is, of course, a line of argument, which I haven't discussed in my presentation, to say, so we just get rid of the law. You know, this is the classic Marxist line, right? But I think even Marxists today are no longer holding this, because it's clear that complex social systems have to have some form of governance that is relatively abstract and is transferable from small little communities to a broader social unity, unless we all retrieve to small little communities. But if you want to have something more abstract, you can call it something different, but it probably will operate like law-like, right? There's some general principles that we have expectations that others would adhere this to, and there's some authority that says this is right, this is wrong, and might even enforce it. Something of that order we need in any kind of social order, or you can have anarchy, right? But so I think social systems are complex systems that are governed through some kind of normative and increasingly in complex system, increasingly formalized system. And given that, so the question is, you can of course destroy a lot of the institutions that we currently have, you still have to rebuild others. What is the likelihood that you can build new ones from scratch once you destroyed the others and you have a tabula rasa, which you never really have? People very often recreate what was there before. They always do. I mean, I think every revolutionary moment you can show how they have recreated what was there before. And then you can basically destroy it again, but then you have to use very different means to do something differently. So my hope is that we can also create modes of social ordering at scale, because the scales already exist in different ways than what is currently the dominant form in capitalism, by pushing a different direction of ordering. But we still need that order, and so I think the idea that it was dissolve or would wither away is not a realistic idea. So we need to transform it, and that's why I'm saying it has to come from within, because there's no easy way to just lift it out and put something else in that would possibly work.
Thank you.
Atrás, por favor.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a professor in the School of Law here in the university, so therefore I'm less interested in political revolutions and more interested on law. And I think the presentation, the discussion, I wish there would be more people from the law school benefiting from the conversations and from the presentation. And specifically, I teach private law and property law. And I'm very interested in not only the presentation, but also in the work in the Code of Capital book, for example, because it is foregrounding topics that are not usually in the political discussions. It's property law, contracts, and not constitutional law, or perhaps, I don't know, more topical areas of law. But what I see, and that's the question that I wanted to make, is that what you presented was at the beginning a mention of Pashukanism, saying that law is not only something derivative from the economical and political structures, but something that has a value in itself that is worth studying. But what we end up saying is that since these legal concepts and norms were there for a while, maybe even from Roman law or from the medieval, and we can use them for making legal social change. So in a sense, because of that open-endedness of law, then law is actually not that much that at the center. It kind of, we contradict, or we say, actually, we have this property law institution, and we can either use it for entrench capitalism or to combat capitalism. And in that sense, then, because of that open-endedness of law, we can actually use it for anything. Then it takes us to what the discussion was, which is political change and political power, and less so on law. Is that what ends up being the conclusion to this, that actually then law is actually something derivative or secondary to political power, to social change. That's the impression that I'm living, even though I like that we're foregrounding discussions of parts of law that are usually not at the center of political debate. That's the impression that I had.
Yeah. So what you're basically saying is that ultimately we're going back to what Katharina says. You just basically have the material conditions, and then you can, change. The law basically is filled by them rather than has any autonomous meaning of its own. I don't buy into this proposition, and I hope that I'm not conveying that this is where I come out. I think the only way to rescue us from that solution is to have a clear normative concept of what the law is and what it ought to achieve, and it's not necessarily materialist only. So I'm basically putting the capabilities approach in the center of a normative foundation for private law. So if we can conceive private law of trying to ensure that everyone has the ability and the conditions to live the rights that they have reasons to value, how would we then interpret property law or restructure property law? How would we interpret contract, or even deny the enforceability of certain contracts that are simply dictates by some powerful companies that have a boilerplate contract from which they will not budge, and they have all kinds of fine print in that you're just clicking on agree to, but you don't even know what it is. That is not a contract. It's not an idea even of the liberal contract theory on which it was ever built. So I think what I'm trying to say is that in the development of using private law to code capital, we have stripped every normative meaning out of capital and made it basically this tool. It's a toolkit for coding capital. And if we want to bring it back into a form of social organizing that is meaningful for many people, it might also be coherent with some of the ideas that we first expressed in constitutional democracies, we have to give a normative foundation to private law. And it cannot just be private autonomy. You can do whatever. It has to be something more. And that's where I'm trying to pull the two together in a normative foundation rather than going through the political route, because I think this detour of always saying, we have to get the state to do what we want to do. I want to say directly to my private parties, you can't do this to me. You can't enforce this contract. You don't have that property right. Or I actually have a property right, which you might want to call a nuisance, but I actually think it's a property right that is normatively of equal value to what you have, and establish a different system on that basis.
Thank you. I have another question again. I want to pick again on the topic of revolution and reform, because just about my colleague, I think because I'm a lawyer as well. In your presentation, you talked about Renner, and I think it's Karl Renner, which was part of this weird group of Austro-Marxists with Otto Bauer and all of them. So I'm thinking, when they were having this debate between Bauer and Kelsen and this eclectic view of law that Renner had, and at the end, the debate was won by Kelsen, and now we have a Kelsenian system. I think here in the Faculty of Law, we learn a Kelsenian system of law. So I was wondering, Kelsen was pro-reform. Renner, like the Austro-Marxists, were always in the middle. They were not so revolutionary, they were not reformist. So maybe it would be better to go back to Renner and forget about Kelsen that much, or I don't know, which will be the path, because clearly reform hasn't worked, I mean, until now. I don't know. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. It's a little hard to answer it, because I think you're right in that, we certainly teach certainly in many civil law systems, one tends to teach a rather Kelsenite positivism of law. I'm not sure the same is true, for example, for law schools in the United States, where we take a very utilitarian, law and economics driven cost and benefits analysis, efficiency kind of drive to the law. And then we would have to think about how I'm basically saying the common law has been much more conducive for coding capital because of this utilitarian bent. But positivism, of course, plays a role, because if we strip the law of all normative contents, then you can use it as a tool for almost anything, including the utilitarian mode. How to get away from that? I think for me, it's still, you can call it like more like a Marxist normativity, but you need some kind of normativity of the law to protect the legal system as a normative order, not just as a tool for organizing either capital or other forms of social life. So I'm sort of hesitating to say it's either or. We're going back to Ren. I think maybe we should just try something different.
Sebastián.
Gracias. Continuando con el tema de reforma y revolución. Yo, de hecho, cuando leí el anterior libro que tuviste, estuve de acuerdo con que se ha subteorizado o se ha ignorado las determinaciones del derecho, las determinaciones jurídicas dentro del análisis del capitalismo, sobre todo en el marxismo. Es cierto que hay esta tendencia a verla simplemente como una dimensión que va a ser explotada por fuerzas privadas. Ahí estoy de acuerdo con que es necesario comenzar a explicitar los fundamentos y comenzar a razonar la forma en la que juegan un rol importante, ¿no?, en el desarrollo económico real de los mercados. Al momento de discutir formas o sea, propuestas para comenzar a ir contra las tendencias dominantes hoy en día, no pude evitar pensar que tal vez también debería ser necesario comenzar a rescatar ciertas dimensiones sociales que tal vez no estaban incluidas, como, por ejemplo, el tipo de diferencias que hay entre países desarrollados, digamos, entre potencias económicas y países subdesarrollados que tienen relaciones, yo diría, imperialistas con los primeros. O sea, cuando pensamos, por ejemplo, a nivel de reformas, yo no puedo evitar retrotraerme a la experiencia histórica de Latinoamérica y ver la forma en la cual incluso proyectos con los que yo simpatizo, como el de Allende, adolecieron de intervenciones, como sabemos cómo terminó, ¿no? Y no es un caso aislado. Tenemos también el de Arbenz en Guatemala, tenemos que simplemente después de una reforma agraria es que se le hace un golpe de Estado que inaugura un periodo autoritario que, digamos, duró décadas, y ahí tienes un montón de precedentes en torno a estas estrategias que intentaron ser graduales y desde la sociedad civil, ¿no? Que hoy en día se mantienen, yo diría, con otros mecanismos, ¿no? Aquí actualmente, por ejemplo, tenemos hoy en día El Salvador con Bukele, que se está reproduciendo en el poder. A mí me parece de forma autoritaria, sin que haya ningún tipo de sanción económica, ningún tipo de pronunciamiento público, ¿no? Por parte, digamos, de Estados Unidos o el aparato de prensa, en contraste con respecto a cómo se ha atacado a algunos países que, digamos, ni siquiera es que hayan roto con el marco constitucional, digamos, como el caso de Venezuela, sino que, digamos, que desde, como el caso de Lula en Brasil o Sheinbaum en México, manteniendo, digamos, dentro del contorno democrático liberal que tenían, incluso están teniendo, digamos, amenazas de sanciones económicas, digamos, están intentando como someter y evitar la soberanía que tienen, ¿no? Entonces, yo no puedo evitar pensar que, al menos desde la historicidad de Latinoamérica, como propuestas como esta se sienten un poco desconectadas sobre el horizonte real que tenemos de cómo maniobrar para hacer cambios fundacionales sobre el sistema en su conjunto, sobre el sistema nacional, viendo que todavía seguimos manteniendo la correlación de fuerzas entre los países subdesarrollados y los países de centro que dominan las economías locales, hacen que cuando menos tengamos que teorizar esta relación, que creo que en el libro también en el anterior, tú reconoces que hoy en día las sanciones económicas son una forma de someter a los gobiernos nacionales, sobre todo a los gobiernos débiles. Entonces, estas aproximaciones, ¿no?, de bases graduales, yo siento que corren el riesgo con que en el punto de que sean un poco incómodas, como terminan siendo formalmente a partir de sanciones económicas o por lo bajo, nunca dejo de pensar en esas frases de Kissinger diciendo el proyecto chileno no puede funcionar, el socialismo chileno no puede dar un mal ejemplo. Entonces, si el primer año están teniendo un crecimiento económico significativo, tenemos que financiar, por ejemplo, a los gremios transportistas que comenzaron a hacer la huelga con financiamiento de la CIA, como eso está como incluso publicado, ya es público actualmente en los registros que han liberado, ¿no?, décadas después. o tienen que al final financiar, coludirse con las Fuerzas Armadas para hacer un golpe militar, como que terminó viendo con Pinochet, ¿no? Siento que ese tipo de dimensiones me hace pensar entre estrategias que son válidas en esas condiciones. Actualmente, seguramente sabes que en Burkina Faso, para liberarse de la dominación del capital francés, hoy en día tienes gobiernos como el Traoré, que está haciendo una articulación a nivel regional con otros países, ¿no? del Sahel, que está funcionando. Y me parece que tiene premisas muy legítimas y que está intentando evitar el conjunto de mecanismos que siempre han subordinado a las organizaciones descentralizadas de la población civil, que sea en África o sea en Latinoamérica, en muchos casos ha terminado teniendo intervenciones extranjeras que los interrumpen en el momento que son peligrosos. Con Arbenz, cuando toca las tierras que tenía la United Fruit Company, con Allende, cuando hace pública el cobre después de décadas de movilización social, él es el primer gobierno que agarra y lo nacionaliza. Y cuando hace eso, el gobierno estadounidense dice, ok, tiene que irse, porque es peligroso, puede comenzar a expandirse. Y ahorita con todo el tema de Bolivia, cuando, digamos, Morales quiere lanzarse por tercera o cuarta vez, pero cuando quiere volver a lanzarse, igualito que Bukele, el tema era que como él, digamos, es parte de un horizonte que quiere, por ejemplo, nacionalizar las reservas de litio, eso es un punto que no se puede permitir y, digamos, hay toda una movilización internacional para votarlo y luego prohibirle incluso mandarse a las elecciones democráticas, ¿no? Que él tenía una mayoría para poder ganar en las últimas elecciones. Entonces, ese principio con una base económica en países subdesarrollados, yo creo que hace que cuando haya una organización intencionada de bases, tiene esa dificultad enorme que tiene que ser reconocida, tiene que ser teorizada, y el momento de pensar en formas en las cuales debemos de pensar en formas graduales, ciertamente desde el centro, como Mamdani, e incluso con los límites de Mamdani. Mamdani quiere hacer que solamente aumentar gradualmente el impuesto de 2%.
Sebastián, podrías ir cerrando, por favor. Gracias.
En fin, pero para cerrar simplemente eso, como tal vez sería bueno teorizar las determinaciones que hay entre el centro y la periferia y pensar si las articulaciones de la sociedad civil tienen los mismos horizontes y efectividad, por ejemplo, cuando hay relaciones imperialistas de fondo. Me parece que es lo que recomiendo leer las contrapropuestas. Gracias.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me just say that the scope of my book is probably a bit more modest than trying to cover all that. But the basic point is, I think there's public power and there's private power, right? And I think the periphery of the globe has been subjected to both, and very often to a combination of both in many ways. I mean, colonization was started in many parts of the world through corporations that basically did the bidding of both merchants and capitalists and the government, or whether it's the East Indian Company or whether you look at the corporations in Africa. So we've had company states in the past. It was very often private power that ruled in different parts of the world and created the colonial empires. Eventually we're taken over in India by the government, but the two things have always coexisted. The corporate form is a product itself of colonialism, right? So what I'm basically saying, we can either try to use the public realm and use sort of public power to try to rein in capital. I'm basically saying, again, that hasn't worked, not even in the global north countries where you don't have the double whammy of confronting both, but even there you could see increasingly that corporate power is controlling or reining in public power, and the space for publicness, we had this in one of our discussions this morning, the space for publicness is shrinking almost anywhere. So I'm basically saying, well, let's just tackle the space of the privateness. Let's go against them. Private power should also be subject to accountability, wherever it is, doesn't matter where. How to build these institutions, I'm not saying only just having some normative premises will do the trick, but we need to build institutions over time that hold private power to account. That's all I'm saying. I don't think it can only come from the top. That has never really worked, except maybe China might be an example for an alternative, but also at a certain price, right? You need a very powerful central power that reigns in private power, and I think China still does this quite successfully. I don't see another country that has done that. In all the others, you have basically kind of the separation of public and private, but then the private increasingly taking over the public space and reigning in the state. And we have created a global system with the investor-state dispute settlement, which I find much more relevant for this than just economic sanctions, by imposing the threat of litigation on sovereign states, so they can no longer do for their own citizens what they would otherwise do. So I'm basically saying the citizens too, not only the states, should have the power to claim their space. Now, what institutions do we need? More than we currently have. But can we use some of them that we currently have? Yes, we can. And I think there are examples out there in the literature as well.
Yeah, thank you. We have one last question. Daria. Oh, yeah.
Yes, I have a question also about the Code of Capital. There I understood that you explained that it is not that the state is directly captured by the capital, rather that it functioning in the way it is designed to, it tends to benefit the capital. So it is how the law coding functions. But yet in your new book, you propose that the transformation must come by making use of the openings within the legal system as it is. So that means that we should use the code to turn it against itself? That is my question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and so the question is then, what is the underlying logic of the code? And I think the underlying logic of the code as it has evolved over the last 400 years is very much a capitalist code. But I think it would be wrong to say that this is all it is, and and I think there are many examples within the code where there are openings for other modes of organization, whether it's the interpretation of contracts under fairness principles, whether it's giving people the right to trespass on other people's properties to get their own. If you think about marital property, there are many examples where you have much more pluralistic forms of property built into our legal systems, typically in legal systems where there has been sufficient contestation of the principles of the law that you get a greater variety of the law. So that in niches, so far mostly in niches, you see this plurality of legal ordering. And what I'm saying is we can expand this only, not if we keep the logic as it currently is, that we have basically a self-contained private law that gives so much autonomy to private actors and says if you have any problems with that, just go to the state and try to lobby the state that they will do some law in reigning capital. That doesn't seem to work. What I'm trying to say is that we need to have many more mechanisms where private actors, you and me, can have claims against other private actors, hold them to account, to principles that the private law system should enshrine. And that, I think, would be a shift of that entire system, because it could not just say, this is just a system that we can use like a toolbox and code capital, and then we just have to wait until the state does something against us. But there would be much more direct interpretation of claims by other private actors that would say, these are not things that you can do to us, or we'd create and expand our niches within the scope of the law that we have.
Muchísimas gracias a Katharina Pistor por su presentación y apertura a las preguntas, las complejas y las poco menos complejas. Gracias al público por estar todo el día, en realidad, hasta estas horas, y los esperamos mañana nuevamente a partir de las 11 con las ponencias de Nuncio Ali y Diana Piroli. Muchas gracias.